everyone, my name is Janae, and today we're going to be looking at Toni Morrison's Playing in the Dark. So, Toni Morrison's Playing in the Dark critiques literature within American society and how race can create a divide. She challenges classic white writers and how their work is influenced by African American culture. Playing in the Dark was published in 1992, so let's keep that in mind. During the time of the book's publication, Morrison was already a well-established author. She makes it a point to identify herself not only as a writer and a literary critic, but as a reader first. That's where she started. Morrison recognizes the genius of authors like Homer and Mary Shelley, but she also wonders where writers draw their inspiration from and if they had any influence. In a world that is dominated by white writers, it's difficult for someone to find their place when considering their race and sex. She quotes, "My work requires me to think about how free I am as an African American woman writer in my generalized, sexualized, wholly racialized world. Because American literature is mainly dominated by white men, anyone outside of that demographic are discredited for their contributions." Quote, "There seems to be more or less tacit agreement among literary scholars that because American literature has clearly been preserved of white male views, genius, and power, without relationship to be removed from the overwhelmed presence of Black in the United States. As we know, Black people are historically considered second class, as our narrative is often hidden or discredited, as I said. Black culture is often removed from American society, even though Black influence can be found in almost every category of literature. Morrison recognizes this disconnect and coins the term American Africanism. Quote, "I use the term for the denotative and cognitive, yes, Blackness that African people have come to signify, as well as the entire range of view assumptions, readings, and misreadings that accompany Eurocentric learning about people. Steering away from Eurocentric traditions in American culture, which pushes one narrative to retain control of policies that people with position of power built. Historically, politicians in Europe would commission writers and artists to create works that would contribute to their image. This happens in Europe, this happens in America. It's not just an American problem. One example of this that I can think of is Shakespeare and how the king would commission him and he would write plays to favor royalty at the time. Quote, "It is further complicated by the fact that the habit of ignoring race is understood to be graceful, even generous, liberal gesture. The idea of not seeing color, I think, is still a problem, even today. I used to hear it all the time, like a couple of years back, I still sometimes do. But some people think that it's endearing for some people because they think that they're treating everyone equally by ignoring how they look, when in fact it does the opposite. They're ignoring the struggles that someone goes through and is using their privilege to live in ignorance. Yes. Someone can still recognize a person's race and treat them equally while taking their own societal privilege into consideration. Studying race critically was considered to be controversial and still is because of the violent past that Black people have had to endure. Ignoring history is not progress. It just allows people to live in ignorant bliss." Morrison moves on to talk about how racism impacts people who perpetuate it. While it's important to understand how racism affected the psyche of slaves in the South throughout the country, it's also important to understand the mind of the masters and their ideology affects us today. Separation of art and race are seen as problematic because it implies bias. Morrison herself can't help but be accused of race affecting her work as an African American writer, while writers like her are accused of racial inflected language affecting their work. Other readers go through life never reading a single book written by an African American person, and they take that as an accomplishment. To quote, "Like thousands of avid but non-academic readers, some powerful literary critics in the United States never read and are proud to say any African American text." It's interesting to note that Morrison says proud to say. People who have no interest in Black text are adamant on avoiding literature works that can contribute to their own knowledge if they didn't let their own prejudice get in their own way. These readers refuse to cause debate or discourse in their intellectual journey, as opposed to writers who take historical and personal discourses and write about literary criticism. Quote, so it is to them, the creators of American literature, that I look for clarification about the invention and effect of Africanism in the United States. So instead of focusing on the readers who choose to ignore texts written by African American, anyone, people in general, Morrison instead finds hope in writers who are constantly challenging the norm and writing about controversial statements, controversial topics. An example that I can think of today is like teachers who want to have critical race theory in schools. Okay, so now the last half of these few pages focuses on a novel that we're going to talk about called Sapphira and the Slave Girl. Hope I'm saying that right. Written by Willa Cather, published in 1940. The story follows a woman named Sapphira who is dependent on her slaves. She's convinced that her husband is having an affair with a young girl named Nancy. These suspicions are invalid by judging her husband's character and Nancy. Nancy is a young slave girl, and her husband is her husband. It's not very much on about her, but the suspicions aren't valid. To quote, Nancy is pure to avidity. Master Cobra is a man of modest habit, ambition, and imagination. Sapphira's ability to form a suspicion is a privilege in itself because she can be left to her own devices to create false narratives about her husband and Nancy. She is able to plot and scheme as opposed to Nancy, who has to perform involuntary labor. Nancy is a young slave girl. I feel like I should mention if I haven't mentioned that already. Sapphira decides to invite Martin, her nephew, to seduce Nancy and expose her husband. So she's very convinced and she's ready to take this girl down for this affair. So we'll continue. As Sapphira continues her delusion, her daughter Rachel helped plan Nancy's escape to the north for freedom with the help of her father, the reluctant help of her father, I should say. Reading Sapphira's characters, my first thought was that she was giving Karen vibes, if that makes any sense. Sorry. A white woman who was obsessed with her false theories of her husband cheating on her plays into her own delusion that she completely made up. Out of all the women she could have blamed, she suspects the young slave girl. Okay. Sapphira fully plays into the slave mistress stereotype despite her having zero evidence of this affair, just as Nancy was silenced from expressing herself because of her status as a slave girl. Her mother doesn't express any concern for her child until she speaks with Rachel. As readers are led to believe, Till, the mother, does not care for her child's well-being because she never said otherwise. She never expressed any concern for her child. So readers would just assume that she just didn't care. This abrupt scene demonstrates that she does love her child. She does love her child and is not able to express the relationship that they have. So Till and Nancy share some similarities there. I think it's common for people to assume that slave mothers are detached from their children because the child is born into slavery and is the property of the slave master. So when a slave mother, has a child, that child is not considered to be hers. It doesn't belong to her. It belongs to whoever the slave master is. Historically, mothers would prevent giving birth so their child would not have to endure the same life as they do. Instead, the novel portrays the faithful slave. Sapphira's obsession with Nancy comes from her not being satisfied with her own life. It allows her to escape living in her own reality, and she latches on to someone else's because she has nothing better to do. Hmm. Towards the end, Morrison's V. South Nancy's reunion with her mother is representative of how Cather is healing her inner child. Cather was a white woman living in the 1800s, 1900s time, right? She's aware of the racial inequality, but still tries to personify these Africanist characters in her own healing. So when I say that, um, sorry, when I say that, I think it's important to know how white women can latch on to other people's lives because they are dissatisfied with their own life. They become so obsessed with other people that they refuse to take care of themselves and their own problems. So, in doing so, Kathy is kind of doing the same thing when writing these novels and trying to heal her relationship with her own mother. Okay. The book centers around a young slave woman escaping for freedom, but the space is still shared with the people who hold the power to take their perspective from the limelight, from this, and not become the center of attention. Yes, so that novel was very interesting. And to Morrison's point, as she stated earlier, about how white authors were have write these great novels and write these great stories, you can look in certain novels and see how African Americans' perspective, our stories, are used to heal someone else's trauma and inspire them to create great arts for their own benefit. But what about everybody else's? You know what I mean? So thank you for listening. I'm going to attach a interview with Toni Morrison describing literary criticism. Thank you.
That question about is about how black people are perceived elsewhere.
Right.
It's about what will they think of us if we A, B, or C. That is such a censorship, such a self-censorship, that I just couldn't deal with it instantly. And I always knew that I was not going to write keep your best foot forward kind of fake fiction. I felt it was too important. I knew I could not dupe black readers. I thought they would catch me out if I faked it. On the other hand, when they thought about them reading it, they would be perhaps embarrassed or, wonder. Early on in my career, I remember a young woman in California respond. This is before I'd written the second book. I'd only written The Bluest Eye. And she said, I liked your book very much, and I really love you for writing it, and I also really hate you for writing it because I didn't want them to know. So it was like a public relations effort, right, and always being sort of under the white gaze. And that gaze was so debilitating, so hurtful, so it fructified everything. It just, it was either excessive superstardom or something else. It was just a burden. So I determined to write outside that gaze, and that there would be no, token white vision in the book at all. And also, I had always felt in some of the writers who were African American that I liked a lot, that there was always this voice that was not talking to me. It was talking to somebody else over my shoulder.
So they were writing for whites.
In many instances. They were explaining things to people they didn't have to explain it to me. You know what I mean? I don't mean completely, and I certainly don't mean totally, but I think it's not because I'm a writer or even a reader, because I'm an editor, and I can feel that voice when it's being addressed outside rather than within. And that gave it a kind of awkwardness, because you can't, I suppose it exists in other cultures, but, you don't feel that, maybe some Russian writers are writing for the French. Maybe some French people are writing for the English. You know what I'm trying to say? But what has that got to do with anything? So I just determined to stake my claim right there and not at all respond to this overwhelming perception of a non-black or a white gaze that was going to judge, respond to, and evaluate everything that I wrote.